Howdy-ho, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. This show happens because some of you guys and girls are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. If you like the show, you'd like to see it continue, maybe consider bumping up that pledge to $7 or just pledging for the first time at patreon.com/SIFTD. For just $4 a month, you do get this show on day one, but the people who are pledging at the $7 tier get priority when asking questions. But of course, we need questions from everyone. Head to SIFTD.net. There in the header, there's a link to go to our forums where you can ask me questions. And again, you can ask me about anything that you want. Let's get on with this week's question. Okay, first up, we have a query from Kevin. I sometimes hear games journalists call a game a good podcast game. Can you explain what this means? Can you name a good podcast game? Well, guilty as charged. I have used that phrase multiple times. Matt talks about it all the time. And essentially what people are saying when they're talking about a podcast game is a game that you don't have to pay a ton of attention to while you're playing it. So generally games that don't work well as podcast games are games that are really driven by their stories, where there's a lot of cinematics, a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation between characters. Now, one thing you can do to make those games more palatable and make them more like a podcast game is turn on subtitles so you can still read what the characters are saying even though you can't hear them. Because here's the thing, if you're listening to a podcast while you're playing a video game, you probably cannot hear what's going on in the video game. So when people say a podcast game, they're basically just saying, like, this is a game that you can play without the audio, basically, and you won't lose much in the process. Now, you asked me, what is a podcast game? I think most people will have their own definitions of that. I think everybody's different, and some people are okay not hearing the audio in every genre. I'm not that way. There's very specific games that I'm okay with playing while a podcast is playing, or in some cases, for me, I'll play music sometimes while I'm playing games. But those are generally, for me, like free-to-play games. Games as a service are great podcast games. Games where you're just kind of doing the same thing over and over, and even if maybe there are plot points to the game, you don't care that much, or they just don't really matter. Probably the last game that I played a ton while listening to podcasts was The First Descendant. It is a free-to-play, third-person, cooperative shooter. And I would argue, actually, that cooperative games in general are good podcast games because everything's not on you. But generally, like, free-to-play games, multiplayer games are great podcast games. Call of Duty, if you're sitting down at night, want to play 10 or 15 matches or whatever of your favorite match type, throw on a podcast while you're playing that. It doesn't matter. Most people turn off the voice chat in that game anyway because you don't want to hear racist and idiotic statements the whole time while you're playing. So games like that are good podcast games. Basically anything where you can kind of disengage from the game on a certain level and you don't have to give 100% of your attention to the game to be good at it. Terrible podcast game, Souls-likes. Or any game that requires audio, like a music and rhythm game. You can't play a music and rhythm game while you're listening to podcasts because you need to hear the audio to input the controller inputs in time with the music. So anything, I guess maybe if I had to define it most broadly, it's probably any game where the audio doesn't matter that much. All right, next up we have a question from OJD. I'm curious about what you think about the movie industry right now. There's been a trend lately of big budget movies bombing left and right, with Snow White being the latest. In addition, it feels like they go to TV streaming services a month later, or maybe even less. Okay, first off, I'm going to say I have still not gone back to a theater since COVID. I wasn't going to theaters a ton before COVID. I would maybe go once or twice a year to go see big blockbusters in the theater. Movies where I felt like I was getting something extra by going to the theater. That's hard to do these days. I have a 65-inch OLED TV, an amazing surround sound system with a big, like, 20-inch sub. It takes a lot to get me to the theater. So I am not the ideal candidate to ask this because I'll be honest with you, I had kind of fallen off with movies before COVID. And then COVID hit, nobody could go to the theaters, even though that's probably the one time I would have wanted to go because there's nothing else to do and I couldn't go. So I had kind of fallen off with films well before COVID. Really only going to theaters for like Star Wars and stuff that I really, really liked. or things that I wanted to see with other people and sort of enhance the experience that way. So I'm probably not the ideal person to ask about this, but I can just share my personal experiences. I'm a middle-aged guy at this point. I've been going to movies since I was like 4 years old. 40-some years I've been going to movies. I'll just be honest with you, it is becoming increasingly more difficult to find a movie to watch that feels unique or different in some way. I don't know if it was Mark Twain or Shakespeare who said there's only 5 stories to tell, and every story is a permutation or combination of those 5 things. I didn't believe that when I first heard it when I was like 10 or whatever. Now that I'm older, I get it. I do feel like everything is just being recycled, and literally it's being recycled. You just brought up Snow White. How many times has Disney told the story of Snow White in various incarnations? There's a cartoon version, now there's a live action version. This is what's happening. Everything's getting remade, everything's being resurfaced. I really feel like either Hollywood is creatively bankrupt or the studios are just being way too conservative on the projects that they greenlight. Because I just can't find a creative spark that would draw me back to the theaters. I just can't find it. I pay attention to the Oscars every year. I'm like, oh, did I miss a great film? Then I watch them and I'm like, that doesn't look interesting at all. So for me personally, I just have kind of lost interest in movies. And I feel like I'm not alone there. If I talk to my friends anecdotally and my relatives, they only go to movies because they have kids, and the kids want them to go. So they go and see Sonic and Snow White. They went to see that one. But people like us are the ones that aren't going. And to your point, it's because we know that if you don't want to spend $50 to go to see a movie, and that's what it costs my wife and I to go see a movie in LA. By the time we go, park, pay for tickets, get some concessions, etc., it's about $50 for us to go see a movie. So to rationalize spending $50 to see a movie versus $5 when you know that film is probably going to be available for a stream for $5 or whatever in like a couple months, why would you do that? And then here's the thing, like, if you don't go see that movie in the theater, it's more likely that movie will then show up earlier on the streaming services. It's really, for the movie theaters and movie studios, it is a self-defeating cycle. Because what you see is when a movie bombs really bad, it's like up for stream literally like a month later, like you said. So it's this cycle of like, well, if I don't go, it'll be on the streaming service in 3 weeks. And you're right. And so there's very little motivation for people to go to the theater. Also, by now, everybody has a huge TV. Everybody. They're so cheap. Panels are so cheap now. Now everyone has a gigantic TV. They may not have surround sound. A lot of people don't care about sound as much as I do, but they have that gigantic screen, and for them the sound is good enough. So it's just the reasons to go to a theater are dwindling. And I think also just creatively, like, I just don't see movies that I want to go see in a theater anymore. I just don't. Like, all the Marvel stuff now, I don't care. I don't care. And it doesn't look like anyone else cares either. It really feels like Endgame or whatever was like the final straw for the whole Marvel thing. Like, you can try to bring back all these actors from the old films and try to revive it. I mean, that is a desperation move, honestly. It just shows you where the theaters are at. So I hear you, Neo JD. It is kind of crazy how the movie industry is basically just collapsing at this point. I think it was headed that way, and then COVID just kind of tipped it over the top. There's just very little reason to go out and spend a ton of money to watch movies in theaters anymore. Okay, our last question for this episode comes from Bachby. Tariffs imposed by the US should not impact prices in Europe. Could Nintendo impose the higher tariff impacted prices for Switch 2 on other territories just to keep things consistent or to keep from angering American consumers? Could Switch 2 have different prices in each territory? What if Trump finally admits that tariffs are a bad idea and removes them? Would Switch 2 get a big price cut? That's a great question, Bachby. It really is. And it's also very complicated. Tariffs in general are complicated if you really dive into them, but on their face value, they are a tax on, not on the other countries that are importing their goods. It is a tax on the people who are living in that territory. Why in a million years would another country eat that money? Why would they do that? They can just sell their products to somebody else in the world. So essentially, they're a tax on the country and the people of the country that are imposing the tariffs. If you talk to 100 economists, 99 of them will tell you that's what a tariff is and that's what a tariff does. Now, it does become more complicated because You're talking about the psychology of people in different territories and whether Nintendo would take that into consideration when setting prices. So here's the thing. First of all, the Switch 2 would not be the first console to have different prices in different territories. The PlayStation 5 has been that way for a while. Here's the thing, though. The PlayStation 5 is cheapest in America and more expensive everywhere else. So Americans, to your point, have never experienced this, where they would be the ones paying the higher prices for something while Europe, Japan, and other territories can buy it for cheaper. So that would be a big deal. Would consumers revolt or care? Honestly, the vast majority of people who buy video game consoles aren't like us. And in all honesty, they just aren't that informed about anything. I don't even think that they would know that the Switch 2 was more expensive somewhere else. They just wouldn't, unless some idiot, their uncle, sort of weird uncle on Facebook posts a rant about it or whatever. They're not going to even know. People like us will know, and will we care? Yeah. I mean, we'd be angry if we had to pay more for Switch 2 than everybody else. But we're not enough, I guess is what I'm getting at. Although, you think about the hardcore Nintendo fans, there's probably about 10 million of those in the US. I'm talking like hardcore, like crazy fanboy types. Those people could raise a stink that could ultimately get noticed by others, but probably not. Ultimately, this will probably be a thing that we will know about and we'll get angry about, and other people will just be oblivious, because let's be honest, when this really starts happening, when these prices start going up to these tariffs, people aren't going to be worried about the Switch 2, man. If you're a business that imports goods from Canada or anything like that, those are the people who are going to be freaking out about it. The people whose businesses depend on getting cheap parts and other things from these other countries to help build things in America, those are the companies that are going to suffer the worst. Now, the next part of your question on whether if Trump finally admits that economists are right and he's wrong and he rescinds the tariffs, will we get a price drop? That's complicated, honestly, because you have to figure with somebody like Trump who's erratic, Nintendo may not believe that that tariff's going to stay unimposed. I mean, if you're a company and you have to bet billions of dollars on whether Trump is going to change his mind again or not, I would bet on him changing his mind again, which means I would not lower the price at all. I would keep it right where it is, either until he's out of office or until it's like 3 years later when you feel like the coast is clear. But until then, I would not lower the price, because what happens is you lower the price, he puts a tariff on again, and then you have to raise the price again. It starts to become this messaging problem. It is so messy. This is why you don't do this. This is why it's a terrible idea. This is why every economist will tell you it is the dumbest thing you could ever do. A lot of these companies, what they're doing right now is they are stockpiling stuff. So a lot of construction companies, because we get all our lumber from Canada, literally all our lumber from Canada, they're like, I'm buying all the lumber I can from Canada right now, so I don't have to pay 25% more for it in a month or whatever. So what you're seeing is companies stockpiling stuff, or you're seeing what people basically jumping around the verbiage in the tariff. So basically what they're doing is they're assembling things in countries that do not have a tariff imposed on them while getting parts from the countries that do have the tariffs imposed on them. And that's a way to skirt around the tariffs. Just another sign of how stupid this whole thing is. Trump telling people he was going to impose tariffs before he did it is idiotic. It's just so stupid from top to bottom. So will Switch get impacted by tariffs? Nobody knows. Because one day he's like, I'm turning it on. Next day I'm turning it off. The bottom line is that, like, markets hate that. And that's why you're seeing volatility in the markets. That's why you're seeing manufacturers figuring out ways around the tariffs, or you're seeing American companies stockpiling products that they need from other countries to try to avoid the 25% tax. So that's the best I can do. Tariffs are complicated, but at the end of the day, they're really, really stupid. Okay, that's it for Ask Shane Anything. A big thanks to everybody pledging anything at patreon.com/sifted. For $4 a month, you get all our content on day one, including this show. But this show does happen because some people are pledging at $7 or more per month. It's very humbling to see how many people are doing that. I appreciate you people very, very much. If you want to see this show continue, please consider hitting that tier at our Patreon. But like I said, at just $4 a month, you watch this show day one just like everybody else. So have yourselves a great week full of awesome games. We'll see you for Game Face on Tuesday.